Welcome to Storybook Hut, where reading is always a good idea. This book is called A Horse Named Bob. It was written by Dandi Daley Mackall, and the pictures were by Claudia Wolf. Jen loved horses. She loved reading about horses. She even dreamed about horses. Could I please get a horse? Jen asked her mom and dad. We don't have money for a horse, Mom said. Where would you keep a horse? Dad asked. Then one day after school, there was a horse. A big, big horse was eating grass. The horse was in Mrs. Gray's yard. You have a horse, Jen cried. Mrs. Gray frowned. She said, I thought it was an elephant. My brother can't care for old Bob. Now I have to care for him. Jen ran home with the good news. I prayed for a horse, Jen said, and here he is. You'll see, I'm going to be Bob's best friend. Here, Bob, Jen called the horse. But the horse did not come. Jen held out an apple. Bob still would not come to her. That horse will never come, said Mrs. Gray. He does not like anybody. The next day, Jen tried again. She picked grass for Bob. Here, Bob, Jen called. Bob looked up at Jen, but he still did not come. Jen sat on the fence. That's okay, she said. I'll sing you a song. Jen sang, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. Bob still did not come, but Jen knew Bob was listening. Why are you still trying? Mrs. Gray asked Jen the next day. Bob still doesn't like anyone. Jen felt like crying. Maybe Mrs. Gray was right. Bob may not like me, Jen said, but I like Bob. All week Jen visited Bob. She brought apples, she sang songs. Jen told Bob about school. Mrs. Gray shook her head. Give up, little girl, Mrs. Gray said. That horse will never come. Why is Mrs. Gray so mean? Jen asked Dad that night. She's not mean, Jen, Dad said. I think she's lonely. Mrs. Gray doesn't like me there, Jen said, and she's not too nice. Well, Dad said, just be nice to her anyway. The next day, Jen had a plan. She packed 2 apples and a book. It's a horse story, she told Bob. Then she read Black Beauty to him. Bob stepped closer and closer. Jen took out one of her apples. Bob doesn't want your apple, Mrs. Gray said. Jen smiled at the old woman. This one is for you, Jen said. Jen held out the apple. For me? Mrs. Gray asked. I thought you'd like it, Jen said. All of a sudden came a chomp. Bob took a big bite of the apple. You came to me, Jen said. Well, I'll be, Mrs. Gray said. Bob took another bite. The big horse let Jen pet him. Bob likes you, Mrs. Gray said. Sorry about your apple, Jen said to Mrs. Gray. She dug out the other apple. Here you go, Jen said. This is from Bob and me. Mrs. Gray smiled. Jen smiled too. Thank you, Jen, Mrs. Gray said. Bob and Mrs. Gray ate their apples. I think you made a friend, Mrs. Gray said. I think I made two friends, Jen said. The end. See you next time at Storybook Hut, where reading is always a good idea.